Hello there. You're in a quiet, safe place now. It's time to let your thoughts rest and allow the day to gently drift away. As you settle into bed, take a slow, deep breath in and let it go softly. There's nothing to do, nowhere to be, only this calm space and a story to carry you into sleep. Tonight, we're going to travel back, far, far back, to the banks of the Nile, to the heart of ancient Egypt, and into the world of Cleopatra. You may know her as a queen, a lover, or a tragic figure, but tonight, her story will be gentle, quiet, slow, not a tale of conquest, but one of rivers, temples, and dreams. Let the slow rhythm of her life carry you to sleep. Let's begin. Long before Cleopatra was born, Egypt had already been ancient for thousands of years. The Nile River flowed with the same calm pace then as it does now, winding like a long silk ribbon, curling gently through golden sands and green fields. By day, the sun painted the stone temples in warm amber light. By night, the stars scattered across the black sky, mirrored by the dark water below. The river made a soft sound, always moving, always present, a quiet rhythm beneath the noise of the world. The Egyptians believed the Nile was a gift from the gods, and they built their lives around it. Farmers rose with the sunrise, their hands planting seeds into wet soil as ibis birds called from nearby reeds. Children played by the water's edge, while women washed linen under the watchful eyes of statues carved from sandstone. Temples stood along the riverbanks like patient guardians, pillars towering, painted in deep blues, reds, and golds. Inside, priests lit incense, their chants echoing through cool stone chambers. And the people, they watched the skies, they followed the stars, they knew when the river would rise and when it would fall. They trusted in the pattern, a pattern of order, of balance, of Ma'at, the sacred harmony of the world. For centuries, pharaohs ruled as living gods, faces carved into mountainsides, names whispered in prayers, each of them holding the crook and flail, symbols of guidance and strength. But by the time Cleopatra's story began, things had started to change. The land still whispered of the gods, but new voices echoed across the sea. Greece, Rome, foreign powers, foreign ways. Still, in the city of Alexandria, where the sea met the river and marble buildings shone under the sun, a child was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of rulers descended from a general of Alexander the Great. That child was Cleopatra. But for now, rest with the Nile. Imagine its water in the moonlight, soft ripples moving slowly toward the delta, the wind carrying the scent of lotus flowers, a heron lifting its wings in silence. This is the Egypt she was born into, ancient, sacred, still breathing beneath the sand. Let the water guide you forward, gently, into her story. Long before Cleopatra walked the marble halls of Alexandria, the Nile had already shaped empires. The Nile River was Egypt's lifeline. Each year, without fail, it would rise and flood its banks, leaving behind rich black soil. That rhythm, gentle, predictable, sacred, allowed a desert nation to bloom. Wheat fields stretched where nothing else could survive. Towns were built in rhythm with the water. The people watched the river as they might watch the sky, for signs, for meaning, for life. It was from this natural miracle that Egypt's identity emerged. To ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just water, it was a god, a giver, a protector. Its cycles were understood as divine order. And from that divine order, one figure stood above all, the Pharaoh. A ruler said to be chosen by the gods, connected to the heavens and bound to the land. Cleopatra would be the last of these. By the time she was born, the old majesty of the pharaohs was fading, but its shadow still loomed large, in temples carved with stories of Ra and Osiris, in tombs hidden deep in the desert, and in the rituals carried out under torchlight, unchanged for thousands of years. The capital had long since shifted north to the city of Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, Alexandria was not just a city, it was a vision. Wide boulevards, lighthouses taller than any before, a library that gathered the world's knowledge. This was the beating heart of Hellenistic Egypt, half Greek, half Egyptian, a place of learning and beauty, but also of tension. Here, Cleopatra would be born into two worlds. She lived in a palace that faced the Mediterranean, surrounded by Greek tutors, statues of Homer and Plato, and scrolls copied by hand. But outside the palace walls, Egypt remained deeply Egyptian, bound to its rituals, gods, and ancient past. The people still prayed to Isis and worshipped the pharaoh as divine. Cleopatra's world was built on that fragile balance, between old and new, between Nile and sea, between myth and history. And while she had not yet taken her first breath, the story she was about to enter was already heavy with expectation
any other
and uncertainty.
Egypt. Though they sat on the throne of the pharaohs, they were not native Egyptians. Their roots traced back to Macedonian Greece, to the legacy of Alexander the Great. When he died in 323 BCE, his vast empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to one of them, Ptolemy, son of Lagos, who declared himself pharaoh and began a new royal line. From the very beginning, the Ptolemies ruled with both ambition and anxiety. Surrounded by foreign peoples, they clung tightly to Greek culture, customs, and language. Though they styled themselves as Egyptian gods, spoke in temples of Horus and Isis, and paraded through the streets of Thebes and Memphis, inside the palace they lived as Greeks. This dual identity would shape Cleopatra's world, a world balanced between two civilizations. Cleopatra was born into this tangled lineage in 69 BCE, in the grand but fading halls of Alexandria's royal court. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XII, often called Auletes, the flute player. Though he bore the title of pharaoh, Ptolemy XII's reign was fragile. He was seen by many as a weak king, more comfortable in Roman company than in Egyptian ceremonies. Rome, by then the rising power of the Mediterranean, held Egypt in quiet contempt, yet relied on its grain and wealth. Cleopatra was not the only child. She had sisters, brothers, rivals. The Ptolemies, ever wary of outside influence, often married within their family. brother to sister, sister to brother, to keep the bloodline pure. But this created tension, conspiracies, and frequent violence. Poisonings were whispered in corridors. Siblings vanished. Loyalties shifted like desert sands. Even as a young girl, Cleopatra would have learned quickly that survival in her family required more than royal blood. It demanded intelligence, charm, and caution. Though her mother's name is lost to history, perhaps Cleopatra V, perhaps someone else, it's clear that young Cleopatra was raised not just as a princess, but as a potential ruler. She received an elite education, fluent in Greek certainly, but also unusually fluent in Egyptian, something most of her ancestors had ignored. She studied rhetoric, politics, poetry, and philosophy. The scholars of Alexandria, drawn to its famous library, likely knew her by name. By the time Cleopatra reached her early teens, the political winds were shifting. Her father, Ptolemy XII, faced opposition at home and meddling from Rome. He was temporarily exiled and later reinstated, not by the people's will, but by Rome's legions. Cleopatra was watching, learning. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, he left his throne to two of his children, Cleopatra, just 18 years old, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. They were meant to rule together, co-pharaohs, united in name. But as history shows us, power rarely tolerates sharing. By the time Cleopatra came of age, Egypt was still beautiful, but no longer strong. The great temples still stood, the Nile still flowed. But behind the marble and gold, the foundation had started to crack. For centuries, Egypt had been ruled by the Ptolemies, a Macedonian Greek dynasty installed after the death of Alexander the Great. They were outsiders who had become native. They learned the language, adopted the gods, and crowned themselves pharaohs. But the line had grown weak. Each new ruler seemed more isolated, more paranoid, more desperate to keep power within the family. Brother married sister. Nephew plotted against uncle. Blood ties were both armor and poison. By Cleopatra's time, these internal struggles had hollowed out the throne. Civil wars broke out between siblings. Assassinations were common. The court was full of whispers. And while the Ptolemies fought one another, Egypt's enemies watched. Rome, the rising giant across the sea, had become both Egypt's protector and its threat. Officially, Egypt remained independent, but in practice, it had become a client state. The Ptolemies borrowed Roman gold. Roman troops kept the peace. Roman ambassadors moved through the palace halls like they belonged there. And Egypt, once the center of the ancient world, now looked over its shoulder. There were other pressures too. The economy was strained. The once abundant harvests of the Nile had begun to fail. Crops died. People starved. Taxes rose. The peasants, those who worked the land, bore the weight of both nature's wrath and royal debt. Revolts broke out in the countryside, and every time order was restored, it came at a price. Even Alexandria, glittering jewel of the Mediterranean, was not immune. Trade had slowed. The library had begun to lose its funding. The lighthouse, once one of the great wonders, was in decline. Egypt was still proud, but it was tired, and into this fragile, fading kingdom stepped Cleopatra. She was young, just 18, and already marked by loss. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had died amid scandal and exile. Her siblings, each one a potential rival, circled the throne like hawks. And Rome loomed over it all. What she inherited was not just a throne, it was a kingdom in crisis, a nation on the edge of collapse, a world where survival would require more than tradition, or beauty, or divine blood. It would require strategy. When Cleopatra ascended to the throne in 51 BCE, she was just 18 years old. Young, yes, but far from naive. The kingdom she inherited was one of internal unrest and external pressure. Egypt was still wealthy, but its sovereignty hung by a thread. She was not meant to rule alone. Egyptian tradition, by then deeply entwined with Greek customs thanks to the Ptolemaic dynasty, dictated that she marry her brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was 10 years old at the time, and so Egypt technically had two rulers, one a child, the other barely a woman. But Cleopatra's mind, even at that age, was sharper than most. She understood the nature of power, how quickly it could slip through one's fingers. And more importantly, she understood how to wield it. Unlike her predecessors, Cleopatra made a conscious choice to connect with the Egyptian people, not just as a ruler, but as a cultural leader. While earlier Ptolemy spoke only Greek and remained isolated in the palace, Cleopatra learned the Egyptian language. It made her the first in her line to truly bridge the cultural divide. This wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Imagine her standing in the temple of Isis, dressed in traditional Egyptian robes, speaking fluently to her people. To them, she was not just a monarch, she was a pharaoh. That identity, powerful and ancient, had not died out. Cleopatra resurrected it. She embraced the old ways, positioning herself as a divine ruler in a time of political instability. But while she courted public favor, the court itself was dangerous. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, especially a cunning eunuch named Pothinus, saw Cleopatra as a threat. She was too independent, too visible, too competent. They preferred the malleable boy king, a puppet they could control. The whispers against her grew. In the royal palace at Alexandria, a gleaming beacon of marble, scrolls and politics, plots took shape in shadowed corridors. And eventually, those whispers became action. Cleopatra was exiled from the palace, forced to flee the city entirely. Her name was stripped from official documents, her face removed from coinage. She no longer ruled in name, but she did not surrender. She gathered what forces she could. Out in the eastern delta, near the Sinai, she bided her time. Her sisters were watching too, particularly Arsinoe, who had ambitions of her own. The Ptolemaic siblings were often allies by necessity, enemies by design. But Cleopatra had patience, and timing, and luck. Around this time, far to the west, a Roman civil war was reaching its climax. Julius Caesar, having defeated Pompey's forces in Italy, was in pursuit. Pompey, desperate, fled to Egypt, hoping that the Ptolemies would grant him sanctuary. They did not. In a move that would reverberate through history, Ptolemy XIII's court murdered Pompey the Great on Egyptian soil, thinking it would win Caesar's favor. It did the opposite. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he was handed Pompey's severed head. He was horrified, not just at the brutality, but at the insult. Pompey was still a Roman consul, a man of standing. The act turned Caesar from a guest into a force of reckoning. And into this chaotic scene, Cleopatra made her move. The famous story, whether apocryphal or embroidered by later writers, tells of Cleopatra being smuggled into Caesar's quarters inside a rolled-up carpet, or perhaps a linen sack. The truth may be less theatrical, but the result was the same. She arrived alone, vulnerable in appearance, but not in spirit. She presented herself directly to Caesar, bypassing the advisors who had banished her. What did they say? What passed between them that first night? We don't know. But what followed was swift. Caesar sided with Cleopatra. Whether out of admiration, political strategy, or personal attraction, he saw her not just as a claimant, but as the rightful queen. A war erupted in Alexandria. The palace became a battlefield. Ptolemy XIII, once her co-ruler, drowned in the Nile while trying to flee. Cleopatra was restored to the throne. She would rule not with Ptolemy XIII, but with another brother, Ptolemy XIV, barely a teenager. In name, they ruled together. In practice, Cleopatra held the reins. Her reign was restored, but her path forward was clear. To keep Egypt sovereign, she would need Rome. And Rome, for better or worse, would become the center of her world. Cleopatra was now queen, in fact, not just name, but her position was still fragile. To secure legitimacy, she married another brother, Ptolemy XIV, a child. It was political theater. The real alliance, the one that mattered, was with Caesar. And soon that alliance bore fruit. A son, Cleopatra named him Caesarion, Little Caesar. He would be her legacy, her claim, her shield. Together, Cleopatra and Caesar spent time cruising the Nile, visiting temples, showing the people a new royal order. For Cleopatra, it was a triumph. She had survived exile, war, and betrayal. and emerged more powerful than ever. But in Egypt, nothing is permanent, and Rome always remembers. When Caesar returned home in 46 BCE, Cleopatra followed, not as a queen in exile, but as a guest of the empire. She stayed in a villa outside the city. Rumors flew. Some senators whispered of monarchy, of Caesar marrying an Egyptian, of Caesarion as heir. The old guard watched, and they did not forget. Cleopatra, for all her charm and cunning, had stepped into the heart of Roman politics. And Rome, unlike Egypt, did not tolerate kings. The streets of Rome were quieter now. In the months that followed the Egyptian campaign, Julius Caesar's return had reshaped the political landscape. He did not return alone. Behind him came Cleopatra, not in chains, not in shame, but as a guest of the Roman state. She was housed in a villa across the Tiber River, just outside the city walls, in accordance with Roman law that forbade foreign rulers from residing within the sacred boundary of the Pomerium. She brought with her a child, Caesarion, the boy she claimed was Caesar's son. Publicly, Caesar did not acknowledge him. Privately, it was understood that he did not deny him either. For the Roman elite, Cleopatra's presence was unsettling. A foreign queen, an Eastern woman. Her very appearance challenged Rome's image of itself. Senators whispered in corridors, unsure whether Caesar's affection for Cleopatra marked a private indulgence or a threat to the Republic. Cleopatra, ever careful, played her part with precision. She did not interfere with Roman affairs. She made no public statements. But her golden barge on the Tiber, her silks and servants, her child, her position, it all reminded the Senate that Caesar was not just a Roman general anymore. He was becoming something else, and so conspiracies began to take root. Caesar's accumulation of titles, dictator for life, high priest, imperator, alarmed even his old allies. Some feared he would declare himself king. Others feared he already had. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar walked to the theater of Pompeii to attend a meeting of the Senate. He wore a simple toga, without a bodyguard. He had been warned. He dismissed the warnings. Inside the chamber, the conspirators closed in. 23 stab wounds were counted. Among the men who struck him was Brutus, whom Caesar had once treated as a son. When the news reached Cleopatra, she was devastated, but not unprepared. The Roman world was in flux again. Caesar was gone. Her son, Caesarion, was now the unrecognized heir of a dead ruler. Her position in Rome, already fragile, was now untenable. She fled quietly, back to Egypt, back to Alexandria. The world she had tried to balance between Rome and Egypt, between East and West, was coming undone. But Cleopatra was not finished. There was still Antony, there was still the throne, and there was still the child. In 42 BCE, Mark Antony summoned her to Tarsus in Asia Minor. Officially, it was to question her loyalty. Unofficially, it was a test of influence, of intent, of alliance. Cleopatra answered in unforgettable style. She sailed up the river Cydnus in a barge of gold and purple, dressed as the goddess Isis. Perfume filled the air, musicians played, servants scattered rose petals on the water. Antony, a soldier of blunt manners and blunt ambitions, was stunned. When Cleopatra met Mark Antony, it was more than a diplomatic mission. It was a performance, and she played her role to perfection. Antony, though Roman by birth, was a man drawn to spectacle. He admired strength, but adored grandeur. Cleopatra gave him both. From the first moment, he was enchanted, not just by her beauty, but by her intellect, her charisma, her presence. She treated him not as a Roman general, but as Dionysus, the god of wine and war. The message was clear. She would not come crawling. She would come commanding. Their partnership deepened quickly. Cleopatra agreed to support Antony with ships, grain, and gold for his eastern campaigns. In return, she asked for the return of former Egyptian territories and recognition of her son Caesarion as a rightful king. Antony agreed. Their affair, political and personal, grew in Alexandria. Antony wintered with her there, indulging in Egyptian luxuries. They created a mock court called the Inimitable Livers, devoted to feasting, poetry, games, and revelry. It scandalized Roman observers, but for Cleopatra it was strategy wrapped in romance. She tied herself to another of Rome's most powerful men. And Antony, increasingly distanced from Octavian back in Rome, leaned further into the east and into Cleopatra's world. In 37 BCE, he returned to Alexandria again. This time the stakes were higher. He needed her resources for a massive campaign against the Parthians. Cleopatra offered them, but the price was rising. That same year, she bore him twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Later, she would bear him another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Her dynasty grew, mingling Egyptian lineage with Roman blood. And in 34 BCE, she and Antony staged a political spectacle called the Donations of Alexandria. In a grand ceremony, Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings. He named Caesarion as the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. He distributed eastern lands to their children, publicly defying Roman norms. To Octavian, back in Rome, it was a provocation too far. He used the donations as propaganda, accusing Antony of betraying Rome for a foreign queen. Whispers turned into warnings. The Senate bristled. Rome's patience wore thin. By 32 BCE, Antony divorced Octavian's sister. War became inevitable. Octavian seized the political moment. He obtained Antony's will, or claimed he did, and read it aloud in the Senate. In it, Antony expressed his wish to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. To the Roman people, that was treason. The Senate declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. She was no longer a partner in politics. She was now the enemy of Rome. Still, Cleopatra remained confident. Her fleet was strong. Her resources were vast. With Antony at her side, she believed they could withstand whatever came next. But fate was closing in, and their alliance, so dazzling in its rise, was heading toward disaster. By 31 BCE, all eyes turned to the western coast of Greece, to a narrow strip of sea near the promontory of Actium. It was here, in one of the most consequential naval battles of the ancient world, that Cleopatra and Mark Antony would stake everything. Their combined forces were formidable. Antony commanded roughly 500 warships, 100,000 foot soldiers, and 12,000 cavalry. Cleopatra brought a fleet of 60 Egyptian ships and immense supplies. Their position, fortified at Actium, was meant to control the Ionian Sea, a gateway to the Roman heartland. But Octavian was ready. With the brilliant General Agrippa by his side, he launched a campaign of attrition. Rather than engage in a frontal assault, Agrippa cut off Antony's supply lines, captured nearby strongholds, and tightened the noose. Starvation and disease crept into Antony's camp. Desertions followed. Morale sagged. Roman senators who had defected to Antony began to flee back to Octavian. Even some of Antony's own allies began to question his judgment, especially his reliance on Cleopatra. Tensions simmered between the Roman and Egyptian contingents. Rumors spread that Cleopatra intended to abandon the campaign and flee. Others whispered that her influence had clouded Antony's mind. Still, Antony chose to fight. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, under a thick haze of uncertainty, the two fleets met in the choppy waters of Actium. Octavian's fleet was smaller, but more agile. Agrippa commanded with ruthless precision, exploiting weaknesses in Antony's heavier ships. The battle raged for hours, confused, chaotic, brutal. And then came the moment that would haunt history. Cleopatra, positioned with her fleet at the rear, suddenly broke formation. Her ships turned and fled southward, back toward Egypt. Antony, stunned, made a split-second decision. He followed her. Abandoning the bulk of his fleet and army, he turned his flagship and sailed after her. His commanders were left in disbelief. The battle collapsed. Octavian seized the moment and crushed the remaining forces. What had been a war of empires became, in an instant, a flight. The retreat marked not just a tactical defeat, but a psychological one. Antony's reputation, already fraying, was destroyed. Rome saw it as cowardice, proof that he had become Cleopatra's puppet. Back in Egypt, the illusion of strength was gone. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, but the tide had turned. Their enemies were coming. The dream of a shared empire, of East and West united, was in ruins, and in the distance, Octavian was already planning his final move. The winter of 31 BCE brought no peace. Antony and Cleopatra, once the embodiment of Eastern opulence and power, now faced the final siege. Alexandria, once the jewel of the Mediterranean, became their fortress, and soon their prison. They tried to rally what remained. Antony trained what few legions still answered to him. Cleopatra gathered treasure and readied ships, not for battle, but for escape. She sent emissaries, tried diplomacy, even considered negotiating her son's succession with Octavian. All efforts failed. Octavian was patient. He made no rash moves. Instead, he let despair do the work. As spring turned to summer, his forces crossed into Egypt. Towns surrendered without resistance. Defections mounted. Even Antony's loyal officers began to abandon him. The noose tightened around Alexandria. Inside the palace walls, Cleopatra secluded herself in her mausoleum, a grand tomb she had built in advance, part palace, part fortress, part statement. She would not be taken alive. Meanwhile, Antony spiraled. He received false news that Cleopatra had died by suicide. Stricken with grief and hopelessness, he fell on his own sword, a final act of Roman honor. But the wound did not kill him. Servants found him, bleeding but alive. Word was sent to Cleopatra. In a moment steeped in agony and legend, she had him carried to her mausoleum, where he died in her arms. The man who had once commanded legions, who had stood beside Julius Caesar, now breathed his last beside the queen who had undone him. Octavian entered Alexandria days later. He ordered Cleopatra brought to him, not as a queen, but as a prisoner. She refused to eat. Rumors say he intended to parade her through Rome in chains, a living trophy of conquest. She would not allow it. On August 12th, 30 BCE, Cleopatra prepared for death. Dressed in her royal garments, she lay in her mausoleum beside symbols of her kingdom. The details of her suicide remain debated. Some say she used poison. Others claim she smuggled in an asp, a venomous Egyptian serpent, and allowed it to bite her. However it happened, the result was certain. Cleopatra VII, last Pharaoh of Egypt, was dead. Her handmaidens died beside her. Octavian buried her with Antony, perhaps as an act of mercy or strategy. Egypt, once the world's richest kingdom, became a Roman province. Her son, Caesarion, was executed. Her other children were taken to Rome. A 3,000-year dynasty, from Nama to Cleopatra, ended not with conquest in battle, but with a whispered death in a marble tomb. The life of Cleopatra did not end in her mausoleum. Her death only sharpened the edges of her legend. In Rome, she was condemned as a temptress, a foreign queen who lured great men to ruin. Octavian, now Augustus, reshaped her image to serve his empire's foundation myth. He had saved Rome from Eastern corruption. To justify Caesar's murder, Antony's fall, and his own rise, Cleopatra became the villain of history. But time complicates stories. In Egypt, she remained a figure of reverence. Though her rule marked the end of pharaonic Egypt, she was remembered as a queen who fought to preserve her land, her people, and her autonomy, and who chose death over humiliation. Across generations, her myth fractured and multiplied. Painters saw her as a symbol of beauty and sensual power, draped in silk, reclining among cobras and gold. Shakespeare gave her tragedy, a woman undone by love, more human than sovereign. Hollywood dressed her in eyeliner and spectacle, turning her into an icon. Sometimes regal, sometimes shallow, always fascinating. But the truth lives in the in-between. Cleopatra was not merely Caesar's lover or Antony's consort. She was a monarch in crisis, navigating a collapsing world with intellect, force, and boldness. She ruled in 3 languages, wrote scholarly treatises, and commanded fleets. Her kingdom was the last outpost of ancient Egyptian glory, and she fought to keep it alive in the jaws of empire. Today, her legacy endures in books, plays, coins, and ruins. Archaeologists still search for her tomb, somewhere beneath the silted edges of Alexandria or buried along the Nile. Each discovery adds another fragment to her story. Each debate breathes new life into her myth. Was she a victim of propaganda or the author of her fate? History may never agree, but in every retelling, one truth holds: Cleopatra remains unforgettable. Her life, filled with ambition, brilliance, and tragedy, has survived for over 2,000 years. And in that, she achieved what most rulers only dream of: not just a kingdom, immortality.